This article is from the Economic Collapse blog. It's entitled, "Have you heard about the $16 trillion bailout the Federal Reserve handed to the too big to fail banks?" What you're about to read, or hear in this case, should absolutely astound you. During the last financial crisis, the Federal Reserve secretly conducted the biggest bailout in the history of the world. And the Fed fought in court for several years to keep it a secret. Do you remember the TARP bailout? The American people were absolutely outraged that the federal government spent $700 billion bailing out the too big to fail banks. Well, that bailout was pocket change compared to what the Federal Reserve did. As you will see documented below, the Federal Reserve actually handed more than $16 trillion in nearly interest-free money to the too big to fail banks between 2007 and 2010. In the Fed, anyone? So have you heard about this on the nightly news? Probably not. Lately, Bloomberg has been reporting on some of this, but even they are not giving people the whole picture. The American people need to be told about this $16 trillion bailout because it is a perfect example of why the Federal Reserve needs to be shut down. The Federal Reserve has been actively picking winners and losers in the financial system, and it turns out that the friends of the Fed always get bailed out and always end up among the winners. Amazing, isn't it? This is not how a free market system is supposed to work. According to the limited GAO audit of the Federal Reserve that was mandated by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, Ron Paul got that attached to that bill, if I remember correctly, to make sure that at least we had a partial audit of the Federal Reserve, since they're certainly not about to give us a full one. The grand total of all the secret bailouts conducted by the Federal Reserve during the last financial crisis comes to a whopping $16.1 trillion. I mean, think about that. The part they announced for TARP was $700 billion, and we were outraged by that. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve was going behind their back that nobody knew about and secretly giving them $16.1 trillion in loans, like interest-free, which means that they can take that money and they can just make money on it with no risk whatsoever. And they did. They made $13 billion in profit. That is an astounding amount of money. Keep in mind that the GDP of the United States for the entire year of 2010 was only $14.6 trillion. So they lent out more than the United States GDP that year. Wow. The total U.S. national debt is only a bit above $15 trillion right now. And they were lending out $16 trillion? So $16 trillion is an almost inconceivable amount of money. But some of the other dollar figures have been thrown around lately regarding these secret Federal Reserve bailouts. Let's take a look at them and see what they mean. $1.2 trillion. A recent Bloomberg article made the following statement. The $1.2 trillion peak on December 5th, 2008, the combined outstanding balance under the 7 programs tallied by Bloomberg was almost 3 times the size of the U.S. federal budget deficit that year and more than the total earnings of all federally insured banks in the U.S. for the decade through 2010. The whole decade, according to data compiled by Bloomberg. The $1.2 trillion figure represents the peak outstanding balance on these loans, not the total amount of all the loans. Okay, so that's the peak outstanding balance at one point in time. On December 5th, 2008, the too big to fail banks owed this much money to the Federal Reserve. Many of them could not pay these short-term loans back right away and had to keep rolling them over time after time. Each time a short-term loan got rolled over, that represented a new loan. So they just kept playing these silly games and just giving each other free money so that they could make interest, from you and me, when you go to buy a house and a car and all that interest they charge you that on money they create out of thin air. But anyways, okay, 7.7 trillion. Bloomberg is reporting that the Federal Reserve had made a total of 7.77 trillion in financial commitments to the big banks by the end of March 2009. Again, unreported, would not have been known about at all if not for Ron Paul attaching this language onto the Dodd-Frank Act to make sure that we got a partial audit. Okay, add-up guarantees and lending limits, and the Fed had committed 7.77 trillion as of March 2009 to rescuing the financial system, more than half the value of everything produced in the U.S. that year, more than half the value of everything produced. But as mentioned above, a one-time limited GAO audit of the Federal Reserve that was mandated by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act covered an even broader time period and revealed even more bailout loans. According to the GAO audit, 16.1 trillion in secret loans were made by the Federal Reserve between December 1st, 2007 and July 22nd, 2010. That's, let's see, 8, 9, not quite 3 years, but 2.5 years. The following list of firms and the amount of money that they received was taken directly from page 131 of the GAO audit report. Citigroup, 2.5 trillion. Morgan Stanley, 2 trillion. Merrill Lynch, almost 2 trillion. Bank of America, 1.3 trillion. I'm rounding here. I'm not going to go through the whole list. This report was made available to all the members of Congress, but most of them have been totally silent about it. Imagine that. I wonder why. Maybe because that's who pays their salary? One of the only members of Congress that has said something has been U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders. The following is an excerpt from a statement about this audit that was taken from the official website of Senator Sanders. As a result of this audit, we now know that the Federal Reserve provided more than 16 trillion in total financial assistance to some of the largest financial institutions and corporations in the United States and throughout the world. So where is everyone else? Why aren't leading Republicans and leading Democrats crying bloody murder over this report? This scandal should have been front page news for months when it was revealed. I mean, seriously, think about that. It should have been. But it wasn't, and guess what? Not only did the Federal Reserve give $16.1 trillion in nearly interest-free loans to the too big to fail banks, the Fed also paid them over $600 million to help run the emergency lending program. So we paid them $600 million to help run the program for their own bailouts. Wow. According to the GAO, the Federal Reserve shelled out an astounding, I'd say, $659.4 million in fees to the very financial institutions which caused the financial crisis in the first place. Well, I'm gonna have to write a song just about this. In addition, it turns out that trillions of dollars of this bailout money actually went overseas. Really? According to the GAO audit, approximately 3.08 trillion went to foreign banks in Europe and in Asia. That was nice of us. So why were our dollars being used to bail out foreign banks while tens of millions of American families were deeply suffering? Yeah, $3.8 trillion, that's like they could have just given every person in the United States like $10,000, $20,000. I mean, I don't know, but that's a lot of money. Okay, so this is a very good question. Also, it is important to remember that many of these bailout loans were made at below market interest rates, and this enabled many of these financial institutions to rake in huge profits. Yeah, that's because they were charging us much higher rates. According to a recent Bloomberg article, the big banks brought in an estimated $13 billion by taking advantage of the Fed's below market rates. So the Fed's loaning them money at, practically nothing interest rate, and they're turning around loaning it out for 5-10% to us, making a profit off us. Freaking banks! Jeez! While the Fed's last resort lending programs generally charge above market interest rates to to deter routine borrowing, yeah, that'd be a good idea to try to deter it. That practice sometimes flipped during the crisis. On October 20th, 2008, for example, the central bank agreed to make 113 billion of 28-day loans through its term auction facility at a rate of 1.1%. Wow, God, I don't think I've ever gotten that rate. Have you? According to a press release at the time. The rate was less than a third of the 3.8% that banks were charging each other to make 1 month loans on that day. So they're giving the money to their preferred banks at 1.1%. They can immediately lend it out to the other banks and get 3.8%. That's picking the winners. You know what I'm saying? Like, okay, you can have the money, and go ahead and lend it out to the other banks. It's just auto profit. It's supposed to be the other way around. It's supposed to be higher, like they said earlier, to deter routine borrowing, to disencourage the banks from doing this. The rate was less than a third of the three. Okay, I said that. Bank of America and Wachovia Corp each got 15 billion of the 1.1% TAF loans, followed by Royal Bank of Scotland's RBS Citizens, blah blah blah, with 10 billion. Fed data show. Whew. Wow, just handing them money. Let's see, 3.8% of 10 billion. Hold on. 3.8 minus 1.1 is 2.7 on 10 billion. How much is that? Quickly, that's like what, 270 million maybe? So once the financial crisis was over, were adjustments made to the financial system to make sure that this type of thing would never happen again? Of course not. Today, the too big to fail banks are larger than ever. What? The total assets of the 6 largest U.S. banks increased by 39%. So now they're too bigger to fail. Between September 30th, 2006 and September 30th, 2011. So now they are more too big to fail than ever. Yeah, okay. So that was his line. But this is what happens when we allow unelected central bank bureaucrats to run our financial system. Yeah, that is what happens when you let bureaucrats run things. Most Americans do not realize this, but the truth is that the Federal Reserve is not part of the government. Did you know that? I knew that. But I only learned it recently. In fact, it is about as Federal Express is. The Federal Reserve has admitted that they are a privately owned institution in court many times, and you can see video of a Federal Reserve employee admitting that the Federal Reserve is privately owned right here. To take it even a step further, it is privately owned by the richest families around the world who understand that if you control the money, you control pretty much everything. The Federal Reserve is an out-of-control monster that is throwing around trillions of dollars whenever it wants to. Nobody should be allowed to do this. I mean, seriously, they really shouldn't. Nobody should be allowed to give bailouts to banks and corporations without the express permission of the U.S. Congress and the President of the United States. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that it's in the Constitution that it has to be that way. That's kind of what Ron Paul, when he says he's a constitutionalist, is. I think that's kind of his point. The Federal Reserve decided this week that it's going to provide, this is a couple months back, to provide liquidity support to Europe. If the American people do not like this move, that is just too bad. We do not get a say in the matter. Are you starting to understand why I keep pushing the idea that it is time to shut down the Federal Reserve? Please share this information about the secret $16 trillion Federal Reserve bailout with your family and your friends. Well, in my instance, my YouTube audience. If we can get enough people to wake up, perhaps there is still a chance to change the direction that this country is headed. Alright, so I think you can understand why after reading this, I feel like a lot of people don't like to read, but maybe if I read it for you and threw in some comments to help you not fall asleep, you might enjoy it more. So if you do, please share it. I appreciate it. It's just something I'm trying out. Normally I do lyrics and try and connect with musicians and make music, but I've been reading these articles and I got the idea to practice my speaking ability by doing this. So I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please hit like for me. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.